If you think you've heard dark prison stories before, nothing will prepare you for what happened inside Carandiru. This is the kind of nightmare that makes hardened criminals wake up screaming. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment if you dare to go deeper into the darkest corners of criminal history. You're going to need it after what you're about to witness. October 2nd, 1992. São Paulo, Brazil. The emergency dispatch received a call that would echo through history. Inside Carandiru Penitentiary, the largest prison complex in Latin America, a full-scale riot had erupted. But what the authorities didn't know yet was that by the time the sun set that day, the white walls of Pavilion 9 would be painted red with the blood of over 100 men. The morning started like any other in hell. 8,000 inmates packed into a facility built for 4,000. The air inside was thick, suffocating, heavy with the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and desperation. Carandiru wasn't just overcrowded. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. In Pavilion 9, tensions had been building for weeks. Rival gang factions controlled different sections of the 5-story cell block. The Venezuelan gang on one side, the São Paulo crime family on the other. Guards rarely entered the pavilion anymore. They had lost control long ago. The inmates ran their own justice system now, brutal and unforgiving. That afternoon, a soccer match between rival gangs turned violent. What started as shoving became punching, then stabbing. Within minutes, the entire pavilion descended into chaos. Makeshift weapons appeared from nowhere. Sharpened toothbrushes, metal bars torn from beds, shanks carved from stolen kitchen knives. Blood splattered across the concrete floors as inmates attacked each other with savage fury. The guards retreated to the outer gates, locking the pavilion from the outside. Standard protocol, they would say later. Contain the violence, let them tire themselves out. But someone made a call to the military police. Someone decided this riot needed to be crushed with overwhelming force. Colonel Uberaton Guimarães received the order at 4:23 p.m. Take back Pavilion 9. Use whatever force necessary. He assembled a battalion of 321 military police officers, armed with rifles, shotguns, and pistols. They wore black tactical gear and carried themselves with the confidence of men who had never faced real accountability. The convoy of police trucks pulled up to Carandiru's gates at 4:45 p.m. Inmates watching from cell windows felt their stomachs drop. This wasn't the regular prison guard response. This was an invasion force. Guimarães gathered his men in the courtyard. His orders were simple and chilling. Restore order, show no weakness, make an example. The officers checked their weapons, loaded extra magazines, and prepared to enter a war zone. Inside Pavilion 9, some inmates realized what was coming. The fighting stopped. Gang leaders called for a truce. Men dropped their weapons and backed toward their cells. A few tried to wave white shirts through the bars, desperate signals of surrender. But it was too late. The military police had already breached the outer doors. The first shots echoed through the pavilion at 5:02 p.m. Then came the sound every prisoner dreads, boots on metal stairs, dozens of them, ascending all 5 floors simultaneously. The tactical teams moved with military precision, fanning out across each level. What happened next would be disputed for decades, but the evidence tells a clear story. The police didn't just suppress a riot. They executed a massacre. Inmates scrambled into their cells, pressing themselves against the back walls, raising their hands in surrender. It didn't matter. Officers fired into cells at point-blank range. Men were shot in the back while trying to hide under beds. Others were gunned down while kneeling with hands behind their heads. Carlos Alberto dos Santos, a 23-year-old inmate serving time for theft, watched from a cell as officers moved down the corridor. He heard his cellmate whisper a prayer. Then the door burst open. The last thing Carlos saw was the barrel of a rifle aimed at his face. The shooting continued for 27 minutes. When the military police finally withdrew from Pavilion 9, an eerie silence fell over the complex. Then came the screaming. Wounded men crying for help. Others calling out names of friends, brothers, cellmates, hoping for responses that would never come. Guards who entered the pavilion afterward described a scene from hell itself. Bodies stacked in corners. Blood pooled so deep in some cells it spilled into the corridors. Bullet holes covered every wall, some at knee height, some at execution level. The smell of gunpowder mixed with death hung in the air like a curse. By the time medical teams were finally allowed in, 111 men were dead. None of them were police officers. Not a single member of the tactical team had been shot. But when they opened the locked infirmary door on the third floor, what they found would change everything they thought they knew about that day. The infirmary door swung open with a metallic groan that echoed through the blood-soaked corridor. Dr. Drauzio Varela, a physician who had been volunteering at Carandiru for years, pushed past the military police officers blocking the entrance. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. 23 bodies lay crammed inside a room meant for medical treatment. But these men hadn't died from riot injuries. They had been shot while receiving care. Bandages still wrapped around old wounds. Fur lines dangled from arms. One man lay on an examination table, a bullet hole through his chest, his eyes frozen wide in disbelief. The white coats of 2 inmate orderlies were soaked crimson. They had died trying to protect the wounded. Dr. Varela's hands trembled as he examined the bodies. Entry wounds in the back, execution-style shots to the head, defensive wounds on hands raised to block bullets. These men had been murdered while seeking medical help. This wasn't crowd control. This was systematic extermination. Outside the pavilion, Colonel Guimarães stood smoking a cigarette, his uniform spotless despite commanding an operation that left 111 men dead. He briefed his superiors with clinical detachment. The riot had been suppressed. Order restored. His men had acted with appropriate force against armed and violent criminals. When asked about casualties, he shrugged. They made their choice when they started fighting. But the bodies told a different story, and that story was about to explode across Brazil and the world. By midnight, reporters had gathered outside Carandiru's walls. News helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, prison officials scrambled to control the narrative. They claimed the inmates had been armed with guns smuggled into the facility. They said the police had been fired upon first and merely defended themselves. They insisted the death toll, while tragic, was the inevitable result of criminal violence. The survivors knew the truth. In cell block C, Marco Antonio Silva huddled in the corner, still alive by sheer luck. The bullet meant for his head had struck the concrete wall inches away, showering him with debris. He had played dead for 30 minutes while officers moved through the corridor, occasionally firing additional shots into bodies to ensure no one survived. Now, as dawn approached, he carved a message into the wall with a piece of broken metal. They murdered us. October 2nd, 1992. Remember. 23-year-old inmate Josemar Almeida survived by hiding in a ventilation shaft. From his position, he had witnessed everything. He watched officers shoot men who were already wounded, who were begging for mercy, who had their hands raised in surrender. He saw them reload and continue firing into cells that had gone silent minutes before. Most disturbing of all, he heard them laughing. Some of the officers were laughing as they killed. The following morning, human rights organizations descended on São Paulo. Journalists demanded access to the pavilion. International pressure mounted. The Brazilian government, already facing criticism for police brutality and prison conditions, found itself backed into a corner. They couldn't hide 111 bodies. Forensic teams began the grim work of documenting the crime scene. Dr. Paulo Sergio Pinheiro, a forensic pathologist, led the investigation. What he discovered would dismantle every claim the military police had made. Of the 111 dead, 103 had been shot. Not a single firearm was found among the inmates. The so-called armed riot was a fabrication. The autopsy reports revealed a pattern that made even seasoned investigators sick. Multiple victims showed signs of being shot while lying on the ground. Bullet trajectories indicated execution-style killings. Several men had been shot in the back while running away. Others bore wounds consistent with being shot through cell bars while pressed against the back wall. The average victim had been shot 3.4 times. Some bodies contained as many as 15 bullets. One victim, 19-year-old Ronaldo Silva had been awaiting trial for a minor theft charge. He wasn't even a convicted criminal yet. The bullet that killed him entered through his raised palm, traveled through his forearm, and struck his heart. The forensic report concluded he had been shot while begging for his life, his hand held up in a futile attempt to stop the bullet. As evidence mounted, Colonel Guimaraes maintained his innocence. In a televised interview, he sat rigid and defiant, insisting his men had acted professionally. "We faced a violent rebellion. We did what was necessary to restore order. Those men were criminals, violent offenders. They chose violence, and they faced the consequences." But behind closed doors, panic spread through the military police ranks. Officers who had participated in the operation began receiving threats. Not from criminals, but from their own commanders. "Keep quiet. Stick to the story. Anyone who talked would face consequences." Some officers refused. They had families, consciences, futures to protect. They began secretly meeting with investigators, providing testimony that contradicted the official narrative. Detective Marilia Gabriela, assigned to interview survivors, sat across from inmate after inmate, hearing the same story repeated with horrifying consistency. The police had entered with intent to kill. They had shown no mercy. They had hunted men through the pavilion like animals. One survivor, tears streaming down his face, grabbed her hand and said, "You have to understand. We stopped fighting. We surrendered. They killed us anyway." By the end of the first week, the truth was undeniable. The Carandiru Massacre, as it became known, wasn't a response to violence. It was state-sanctioned murder on a massive scale. The Brazilian government announced a formal investigation. Charges would be filed. Justice would be served. But deep in the corridors of power, another conversation was taking place. How do you prosecute 300 police officers without destabilizing the entire security apparatus? How do you admit that the state murdered over 100 men in cold blood? Then came the discovery that would shatter any remaining faith in the system. In a locked evidence room, investigators found something the military police had tried to destroy, a cassette tape recording from the prison's security system. Someone had been recording that afternoon. When they played the tape, the sounds of the massacre filled the room. Gunshots, screaming, officers shouting commands to fire. And underneath it all, barely audible but unmistakable, the sound of men pleading for their lives in Portuguese. "Please, no, I surrender. Please don't kill me." The tape was 17 minutes long. 17 minutes of systematic execution, preserved forever on magnetic tape. But buried in the final minute of the recording was something even more chilling, a voice giving an order, calm and clear, that would change everything they thought they knew about who was really responsible for the massacre. The voice on the tape belonged to Major Adriano Reis, second in command of the operation. His words were methodical, devoid of emotion, the tone of a man following a script. All levels, continue sweep. No witnesses. Repeat, no witnesses. Command authorization confirmed. No witnesses. The phrase hung in the air like a death sentence, because that's exactly what it was. This wasn't a riot response gone wrong. This was a planned extermination, authorized from the top, executed with military precision. Someone high up in the chain of command had given the order to make sure that anyone who could testify to police brutality would never leave Pavilion 9 alive. Detective Marilia Gabriela stared at the transcript, her blood running cold. Command authorization confirmed. That meant someone above Colonel Guimaraes had approved this. Someone in the state government. Someone who saw a prison riot not as a crisis to be managed, but as an opportunity to send a message to every criminal in Brazil. The state owns your life, and it can take it whenever it chooses. The investigation entered dangerous territory. Politicians who had initially called for justice suddenly went silent. Police unions threatened strikes if their officers were prosecuted. Media outlets that had covered the story aggressively began receiving pressure from advertisers and government officials. The message was clear: bury this or face consequences. But some people refused to be silenced. Families of the victims organized protests outside government buildings in São Paulo. Mothers held photographs of their dead sons, many of them young men who had been awaiting trial for minor offenses, killed before they ever saw a courtroom. Maria Santos, whose 20-year-old son Diego had been shot 7 times in his cell, spoke to crowds with raw fury in her voice. "They call our children criminals, but who are the real criminals? The men who stole to feed their families, or the men who murdered 100 souls and called it justice?" International human rights organizations condemned Brazil. The United Nations launched an inquiry. Amnesty International published a damning report documenting execution-style killings and evidence tampering. The pressure became impossible to ignore. In 1993, Colonel Uberatan Guimarães was charged with 111 counts of murder. It was a historic moment, the first time a Brazilian military officer had faced such serious charges for actions during a prison operation. The trial began in 2000, 8 years after the massacre. By then, many witnesses had disappeared. Some had been released from prison and vanished into Brazil's favelas, too terrified to testify. Others had died under suspicious circumstances. One key witness, Marco Antonio Silva, the man who carved the message into the cell wall, was found dead in a ditch 3 months before the trial began. Official cause of death: drug overdose. His family insisted he had been clean for 2 years. The courtroom was packed with victims' families, human rights activists, and journalists from around the world. Guimarães sat stoic and defiant, his lawyers arguing that he had merely followed protocol, that the inmates had been violent and dangerous, that his men had feared for their lives. They painted a picture of heroic officers facing impossible odds against savage criminals. But the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic experts testified about execution-style wounds. Survivors described systematic murder. The security tape recording was played in court, the sounds of pleading voices and gunfire filling the room. Several family members collapsed, hearing the final moments of their loved ones' lives. In 2001, Colonel Uberatan Guimarães was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 632 years in prison, later reduced to 171 years on appeal. It seemed like justice had finally been served. But Brazil's legal system had one more betrayal in store. In 2006, an appeals court overturned the conviction. The judges ruled that Guimarães had been following orders, that he couldn't be held individually responsible for a military operation authorized by his superiors. After serving less than 2 years, he walked free. The courtroom erupted in screams and sobs. Maria Santos lunged toward Guimarães, held back by security, shouting, "You murdered my son. You murdered him, and they let you go." Guimarães left the courthouse to cheers from fellow police officers who viewed him as a martyr, a good soldier punished for doing his duty. He gave interviews claiming vindication, insisting he had saved lives by suppressing a dangerous riot. He showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of the 111 lives ended under his command. But karma has a way of finding men who escape earthly justice. On September 10, 2006, just 3 months after his release, Uberatan Guimarães was shot 12 times outside his home in São Paulo. The killers were never found. Police officially classified it as a botched robbery, but everyone knew the truth. Someone had delivered the justice the courts had failed to provide. Of the 321 officers who participated in the Carandiru Massacre, only 74 were ever charged. Most were acquitted. Some received suspended sentences. Not one spent significant time in prison. The man who gave the order heard on the tape, Major Adriano Reis, was never charged at all. He retired with full benefits and disappeared from public life. In 2002, the Brazilian government made a stunning decision. They would demolish Carandiru Penitentiary entirely. They claimed it was about reform, about moving past the brutal prison conditions that had led to the massacre. But survivors and activists knew the real reason. They were erasing evidence. They were burying history. On December 8, 2002, demolition crews began tearing down Pavilion 9. Maria Santos stood outside the fence, watching the walls come down, tears streaming down her face. "They're not just destroying a building," she said to a reporter. "They're destroying the truth. They're making sure nobody can ever prove what really happened." Today, a public park stands where Carandiru once loomed over São Paulo. Families picnic on grass that covers the ground where 111 men were slaughtered. There's a small memorial plaque, easy to miss, with a date October 2nd, 1992, and a brief mention of a tragedy. No names, no details, no accountability. But the survivors remember. Jose Mar Almeida, who hid in the ventilation shaft, still wakes up screaming. He lives under a false name now, terrified that speaking out will make him a target. In 2019, he agreed to one interview, his face hidden, his voice disguised. His final words haunt everyone who heard them. People think the Carandiru Massacre was one terrible day. But it wasn't. It was the day Brazil showed us that some lives don't matter. And that truth, that reality, kills people every single day in prisons across this country. The official death toll remains 111. But investigators believe at least 15 other inmates died from injuries in the days following the massacre, deaths that were never added to the official count. And in the years since, dozens of witnesses and survivors have died under mysterious circumstances. The Carandiru Massacre stands as the deadliest prison incident in South American history. It exposed the brutal reality of a justice system that values order over human life, that protects those in power while crushing those without it. The world looked away, but the families of the victims never forgot. They thought tearing down the prison would erase the memory. They thought releasing the guilty would close the chapter. But 23 years later, in other prisons across Brazil, the same violence continues. Different names, different dates, same story. Because nothing really changed after Carandiru. The massacre was never an aberration. It was the system working exactly as designed. And somewhere tonight, in a prison cell in São Paulo, an inmate looks at the scarred walls and wonders if the officers outside his door see him as a human being, or just another body waiting to become a statistic.